Hello and welcome to Buy Africa, the show where we focus on investment opportunities around the continent. I'm Tshepo Modiba, and thanks for joining me. Tonight, I'm joined by Erika van der Merwe, CEO at Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, for a closer look at private equity in Africa. Erika, let's jump into it. I mean, on the face of it, this should be a very exciting chat, right? Combining two very exciting areas, private equity and Africa, right? Well, certainly this was the story 2-3 years ago. Is that still the case now?
I think it still is an exciting region. So I agree with you. Private equity presenting an enormous opportunity for institutional investors globally to gain access to the growth story in Africa.
Right.
So we know that listed markets across the continent aren't as deep and as broad as the average investor would like them to be, nor do they necessarily represent or offer exposure to the kinds of sectors where one would find the exposure to the emerging African consumer.
Right.
So private equity offers that, seeking that opportunity. And then the African continent, so for a number of years now we've seen the analysis about how exciting the continent is. Truth be spoken, over the last year or so we see some of that being tempered and perhaps not as exciting as initially expected, but nevertheless is a high growth area, it nevertheless is a frontier market.
Right.
And for investors wanting to diversify their portfolios across asset classes and across region, it's a very compelling opportunity.
Right. Now, in terms of, I guess, fundraising for the sector over the last couple of years, what are the trends been like? Is this an area where, excitement aside, money is actually flowed in and we're starting to see traction there?
Yes. Well, in 2014, we did a piece of research with AFCA, the African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, together with Rescura, doing an analysis survey amongst major global institutional investors, asking them about their appetite for sub-Saharan Africa relative to other emerging markets. And in that survey, 85% said they expect private equity to outperform the listed markets in the region, and 80% said they plan to increase their exposure to sub-Saharan Africa over the coming 2 years.
Right.
And we saw that in 2014, we had record fundraising for the sub-Saharan African region. 2015, we don't yet have the full year numbers, and this is data presented by IMPIA, the Emerging Markets Private Equity Association. But it's possible that fundraising in 2015 could match what we saw in 2014. So you certainly have seen a pickup. It's possible that we will see a tempering of that in 2016, just given the sheer scale of the fundraising that's been done by major houses, major emerging markets and sub-Saharan African funds that have raised. And we know the fundraising process is a cyclical one. Funds typically will return to the market every 5 years or so to raise a new fund. So funds would be raised, it is then closed, and those assets, the funds, the capital is deployed into deals. So what we'll be seeing this year, I think it will be a big emphasis on the deal making. So the funds that have been raised being deployed.
And what sort of deal making are we likely to see? What sort of sectors are these funds targeting?
From what we see is that the kinds of sectors targeted are across the industry spectrum, but a common theme there would be the emerging consumer. So consumer goods, consumer durable goods, financial services, and also even underpinning that infrastructure, private equity being a major investor in infrastructure on the continent. So you'll see that.
So it's, I guess, a pretty specified way of targeting that particular story, which most investors agree is a pretty decent story.
Exactly, yes. And I think it's very important to access that growth story. It's quite a competitive market. You're seeing all sorts of investors, not just private equity investors, but corporate investors, multinationals seeking those opportunities. So I think it's important to have access to that in the early stages to be able to benefit from the growth that will emanate.
Right, and in terms of, I guess, specific markets or countries throughout the continent, are there any more prominent than others in terms of capturing a lot of this demand for deals?
I think it varies for various reasons. So the South African and thus the Southern African region is the most established, the largest, because of South Africa's history dating back about 30 years.
Sure.
So you've got the most established managers with track record. The other exciting areas would be West and East Africa. So East Africa would be, for instance, around Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, also Ethiopia and Rwanda. West Africa, you've got Nigeria and Ghana, sort of different stories. So a lot of excitement, and managers would specialize in certain regions, possibly, although you do have managers that specialize across the broad region, would then just have local offices in those regions.
Okay. And I guess from a long-term return perspective, there's a lot to be bullish about in spite of the current dip.
So the current dip, I'm assuming you're referring to
current
economic circumstances. I mean, the currency foreign exchange risk always is a concern.
Right.
But for many of these African funds, they are dollar denominated. So for European, US, Middle East, Far Eastern investors, of whom there are many, the currency risk would be mitigated because there's no currency conversion. It would be important for investors to look for diversified funds and to make sure that any risk is spread across sectors, across managers, and across sort of geographic regions. So much to be excited about, and what we always say about private equity is that it's a hands-on management approach. So it's a very careful, close due diligence process in selecting the deal, but then it goes beyond that. It's not just about providing the capital, it's about an active hands-on management process to make it a better business.
Right, and in terms of, I guess, the nature of the investor, is it a lot of US and European money rather than African money going into private equity? Is there some sort of traction of African money going into the space?
That's a great point. Well, the answer to the first question is mainly non-African institutional investors going into African funds and the regions that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. In our opinion, there's a great opportunity, and hopefully we'll see that unfolding in the next 10 years, where you see Africa investing for Africa. So we know there are huge pockets of capital in the African region and in the major economies. Right. Research shows that $29 billion is available from within African pension funds to allocate to private equity. That is a huge amount. So if we can see that unfolding, instead of capital being allocated to just listed equity or just government bonds, to being deployed to support development and growth in the region, it would be fantastic.
And then I guess in terms of focus, are we likely to see infrastructure type initiatives being backed by these private equity deals?
Infrastructure certainly is a major deal, a major focus theme for private equity, and it has been for last 10, 20 years. You've had the development finance institutions, the European DFIs investing in infrastructure and supporting private equity managers that specialize in infrastructure. Right. So you have that component as well.
And doing well from it?
And doing well from it, yes. Okay. So in many cases, those funds, so a typical private equity life cycle is over a period of 10 years. Infrastructure funds, maybe 10 years, some of them 12 years. So it's a slightly longer cycle, especially if you're starting from a greenfields process, so establishing infrastructure from scratch.
So I guess given the nature of the continent, perhaps private equity is one of the ideal ways of accessing it, because you are forced to look long term. You talk about the 10-year investment structure. I guess some of the larger institutional investors in the continent probably should be considering this a lot more.
We would argue strongly in favour, and thank you for saying that. So yes, so the long-term asset, ensuring long-term sort of impact and development. The DFIs, the development finance institutions that I mentioned, so they would harness US and European capital in many instances with a strong developmental mandate. So they would allocate the funds and tell the private equity manager, here's the money, but we want to see progress on the ESG, environmental, social and governance metrics. So it really is about seeing the bigger picture and ensuring that those important mandates are translated through.
And then in terms of the underlying skill sets of the private equity players, are there a lot of impressive players who are doing and executing great deals in the continent?
So you're talking about individuals operational?
Yeah.
So the skills levels, I mean, if I can just talk at a very macro level, so what we're seeing certainly in the South African context, but also to a large extent you're seeing elsewhere, financial qualifications, chartered accounting type qualifications, MBAs, CFAs, many of them with investment banking, corporate banking experience, but also the transactional deal making experience is essential. Right. So you're seeing that, and if you talk about houses, there are a number of houses with extensive track record on the continent, sort of Pan-African experience, as well as funds with regional and local experience. So the institutional investors investing into funds would be looking for institutional quality managers, so those with track record.
Right. Given that, and given, I guess, the economic opportunities, again, this is something to be excited about. I'm constantly looking for things to get excited about. It's a pretty bleak environment right now economically, but is this a space that is still exciting?
Well, of course, we believe it is, and given the fundraising that we've seen in 2014 and 2015, we're going to see the excitement as those funds, as the capital is deployed. So you're going to see private equity fund managers active. We're going to see it in the news headlines as they do deals across the continent. Yes.
Okay. And you touched on specifically executing in West Africa. I'm assuming Nigeria is quite a big chunk of that. Is there a move for the likes of the DRC for those funds targeting the likes of DRC?
So, referring specifically to DRC, are you using that as an example of frontier markets where perhaps higher risk? Yes. Not to an enormous extent, but you are seeing funds with that particular mandate, with that particular appetite to invest in higher risk, perhaps more volatile regions, primarily because of the potential developmental impact, but also if they have a clear understanding of that specific jurisdiction, I mean, their perception of the risk would be different. So you certainly would have managers active in more frontier markets, but I would think that's a smaller component of the total African investment.
Right. So the total African investment is probably focused to the more established markets.
Exactly. So Southern, West, and East Africa. Okay. Yes.
And the North in particular, any private equity funds going to the likes of Egypt?
Yes, there is. I don't have much experience or exposure to that, but certainly North Africa is an active region. Tunisia also an active region, also with private equity associations of their own. So it's certainly active, also relatively established. Yes.
Okay. So I guess if we're going to wrap up, would you again encourage people to be looking at private equity as a long-term vehicle here?
So we always to remember that private equity is a wholesale asset class, so for institutional investors. So we're talking to pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance houses, large family offices and the like. Right. And I think the big opportunity, as we mentioned earlier, would be pension funds, South African pension funds, to really make sure that they understand the asset class and its impact, its opportunity, its characteristics of diversifying the portfolio because it behaves differently from other kinds of asset classes, because of the returns enhancing characteristics. Certainly in South Africa, we've got the history showing that private equity outperforms listed equity. And then thirdly, the impact, the developmental impact of the asset class.
Perfect. I couldn't say that any better. Let's leave it there. Thank you, Erika. Thanks to my guest, Erika van der Merwe, CEO of Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association. That's all from Buy Africa this week. Remember to follow me on Twitter. That's @Modiba_Tshepo. And send us your thoughts about the show using the hashtag BuyAfrica. For myself and the team, goodbye.